Today, we're going to tell a story that became a tragedy for one family, tearing it apart from the inside and leaving painful wounds that would never heal. This is the story of Jake Williams, a man whose obsession with his brother's wife became an all-consuming fixation he couldn't control. Jake's secret infatuation not only destroyed his brother Michael's life, but also led to events no one could have foreseen. Jake had always been a man of a difficult character. He grew up in the shadow of his older brother Michael, who was always the ideal son and the family favorite. Michael had achieved everything one could dream of: a successful career, a respected position in society, a happy marriage to a beautiful, intelligent woman named Emily. Michael and Emily had a harmony that Jake couldn't ignore. Their love, their closeness, it was something unreachable for him, like a bright beacon he could only observe from afar without any hope of coming closer. At first, Jake tried to keep his feelings under control. He told himself it was just a fleeting attraction, that Emily was not someone he could feel this way about. But with each passing day, this feeling grew, becoming something more. He started noticing little things he had overlooked before: how Emily laughed at Michael's jokes, how her eyes sparkled when she looked at her husband, how she touched his hand gently. This observation became torturous for him, sparking envy and longing. Initially, he tried to avoid both of them. Jake stopped visiting them, made up excuses, but this only intensified his inner conflict. He felt himself being consumed by a dark, painful desire to possess what rightfully belonged to his brother. This desire took root deep inside, filling his mind and leaving less room for rational thought. Soon, he began to find excuses to spend more time with Emily. Small requests for help, innocent invitations for coffee, conversations that seemed casual but were carefully planned. Emily, trusting and kind, never suspected that something forbidden and dangerous was growing in Jake's heart. She saw him only as her husband's younger brother, a family friend, and always treated him with warmth and care. This simple, friendly attention only fueled his obsessive idea. Jake felt torn between guilt and desire. He understood he was crossing every possible boundary, betraying his brother's trust, breaking family bonds. But every time he was alone with Emily, this feeling consumed him entirely, and he couldn't fight it. He thought Emily was unknowingly responding to his looks, that her gestures were becoming slightly more tender than appropriate. These thoughts filled him with confusion, but he couldn't stop. Meanwhile, Emily began to notice changes in Jake's behavior. He became more tense, sometimes even strange, but she attributed it to his personal troubles, trying not to give it much thought. She couldn't imagine that her presence around him could evoke such strong emotions. But one day, when she felt his gaze linger on her longer than usual, an unfamiliar feeling crept over her. It was the moment she realized that something between them had changed, and that something worried her, causing slight anxiety. For Jake, Emily's discomfort was like another needle driving into his mind. He knew her intuition was beginning to sense his thoughts, making his obsession even more painful. He continued to make plans, inventing increasingly subtle ways to be alone with her, and his fantasies grew bolder and more dangerous. The forbidden desire completely took hold of him, leaving only guilt and a sense of impending disaster in its wake. Weeks passed, and Jake's passion for Emily became increasingly uncontrollable. Now he couldn't go a single day without thinking of her, without picturing them together, as if it was not fantasy but an inevitability. This obsession seeped into every part of his life, poisoning his relationships with others, his work, even his own thoughts. He was starting to lose control of himself, and it was becoming evident. Emily couldn't help but notice the changes. Every time Jake was around, he seemed somewhat subdued, his behavior growing increasingly anxious. She tried to ignore it, believing he needed time to sort himself out, but one evening, when he came to their home for dinner, her concern grew. This time, Jake looked especially tense, and she felt his gaze linger on her more often, becoming heavy and unsettling. At dinner, an uncomfortable silence hung over them that Michael could feel as well. He noticed something troubling his brother, but didn't know the reason. To Michael, Jake had always been the younger brother he could trust, someone he shared his thoughts and dreams with. He couldn't have imagined that behind Jake's outward appearance lay a dark, painful desire. When dinner ended, Emily offered Jake a cup of tea, as she usually did. She wanted to support him, to help him cope with whatever was troubling him. But at that moment, she felt her nerves begin to fray. Her intuition told her there was something wrong in his behavior, something her mind couldn't explain, but she tried to dismiss the feeling. Alone with Emily, Jake felt a shiver run through him. He knew he shouldn't have stayed, that any additional time with her only worsened his situation, but he couldn't resist the pull. At first, he tried to start a casual conversation, but his voice shook and his hands nervously fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve. Emily looked at him with mild concern, and her eyes, filled with care and empathy, felt so close that he could barely breathe. Unable to bear the tension, Jake suddenly leaned toward her, his gaze growing heavy and filled with desperate passion. He said nothing, but Emily felt a wave of panic as she realized what he was about to do. She froze, unable to believe that someone her husband trusted could be capable of this. Jake could no longer hold back, and at that moment his whole body spoke of the desire he no longer wanted to resist. He took a step closer, but Emily, terrified, took a sharp step back. "What are you doing, Jake?" she whispered, feeling her heart race. Fear appeared in her eyes and his face twisted in despair. He knew he had made a mistake, that he had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, but it was impossible to stop. His heart pounded so violently, it felt as though it might burst. At that moment, he realized he had destroyed not only her trust, but also that fragile sense of closeness they once had. Jake stood before her, frozen and broken, understanding that his obsession had destroyed all the good that had once connected them. In panic and shame, he ran out of the house, leaving Emily in complete horror. That night marked the beginning of the end for Jake. He knew he could no longer return to his former life, that his actions would forever scar his relationships with both his brother and Emily. He began avoiding Michael and declined invitations, finding every possible excuse to avoid seeing them. Yet his heart was still torn apart and his mind drowned in regret and bitterness. The obsession that once seemed like a forbidden pleasure had now become his curse. Emily, left alone, couldn't find peace. She sat silently on the couch processing what had happened. The thought that her husband's brother, a man she trusted, would dare such a thing was unbearable. Her first impulse was to tell Michael everything, but fear for his relationship with his brother and their family stopped her. She couldn't shatter their bond, knowing it would bring nothing but pain and bitterness. However, with each passing day, the sense of threat from Jake grew stronger. She felt that this was not just an isolated incident, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. She couldn't shake the feeling that he would appear again, that his obsession had only intensified since crossing that line. Her inner peace was shattered, and the sense of security she once felt around her husband was lost. A few days after that evening when Jake crossed the line, life in the family gradually sank into a fog of unspoken words and hidden tension. Jake avoided meetings with Michael and Emily, making various excuses to avoid coming to their home. This behavior became noticeable, and while Michael initially attributed it to routine issues, soon he began to feel uneasy. Michael was sensitive and observant, and any deviation from the norm sparked his suspicion. Emily tried to act as usual, but something had changed in her behavior. She became pensive and silent, often lost in thought as if trying to conceal a heavy burden. Michael couldn't help but notice her distraction, the way her gaze seemed to drift into memories she was trying to escape. Sometimes, late at night, he found her sitting by the window, lost in her own thoughts, which filled him with concern. He decided to talk to Jake, hoping to find out if it was connected to him. However, when he tried to meet with his brother, Jake evaded every attempt, only strengthening Michael's suspicions. They had always shared their thoughts with each other, and this avoidance left Michael with an inexplicable feeling of worry. He recalled moments when he noticed Jake's gaze lingering on Emily longer than usual. These occasional glances, which he would once have dismissed as simple fondness, now took on a darker meaning. One day, when Michael came home earlier than usual, he found Emily cleaning the living room. She hadn't heard him come in, and when he approached her, she flinched as if caught off guard. Michael noticed that her eyes were filled with worry. He tried to smile to lighten the mood, but her tension didn't ease. Fragments of thought started to form in his mind, but he kept trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. Finally, one evening, he decided to bring it up. They were sitting at dinner, and the silence between them felt even heavier. He took a deep breath and asked, "Emily, is something wrong? You've been very quiet lately." Emily looked up at him, her face frozen in silence. She felt that she needed to say something, but every time she tried to begin, the words caught in her throat. Deep down, she knew that Michael deserved the truth, but the fear of family consequences held her back. Her hesitation only deepened Michael's suspicions. He could see her eyes were filled with something dark, but Emily turned away, avoiding his gaze. Meanwhile, Jake was also feeling the pressure. He knew his obsession had turned into dangerous attraction, and it tormented him. Yet, despite everything, he couldn't resist these feelings. Sometimes he mentally cursed himself for allowing his heart to fall into such a destructive fascination. His life started to spiral into chaos, and he knew he could no longer hide his anxiety. One day, by chance, he met Michael in a bar where he had stopped after work. Their eyes met, and despite all his troubled thoughts, Michael decided to talk openly with his brother. He invited Jake to sit down, and as they took their seats, Michael looked at him closely. There was something in Michael's gaze that went beyond mere brotherly affection, and Jake felt a chill run through him. "Jake," Michael said, his voice firm but without accusation, "you seem different lately. I feel like you're hiding something from me. If you have any problems, you can tell me. Jake tried to conceal his nervousness, but his face betrayed him. He knew he had to stay in control, but his brother's words pierced his heart, stirring shame and guilt. He remembered the moment he couldn't hold himself back around Emily, and his heart clenched with pain. He looked away, unable to meet Michael's eyes, as something within him began to crumble. Michael, Jake paused, his voice weak and unsure. He wanted to tell him, to free himself of this burden, but fear of the consequences held him back. He knew that confessing could destroy everything. He suppressed the scream rising within him and finally forced himself to say, I just need some time to figure things out. These words were a lie, but he hoped Michael would believe him. Yet Michael sensed it was just an excuse, that there was something deeper behind it. He chose not to pressure his brother, but a suspicion had already begun to form within him that something between them had irreversibly changed. This shadow over their relationship was growing darker, and Michael felt that something irreversible was about to happen. These encounters and conversations left Michael feeling that his trust in Jake had been shaken. He didn't know what was wrong, but his intuition told him that his brother was entangled in emotions beyond his control. Michael returned home that night with a heavy heart, not knowing how to unravel the dark mystery that was slowly destroying their relationship. Emily noticed that Michael had changed. She saw a shadow of suspicion in his eyes, and it made her heart clench. She knew she couldn't keep the truth hidden for long, but something inside her continued to struggle, trying to preserve this secret. Her life was becoming a battleground, where every glance and every word carried an unspoken threat. A few weeks passed, filled with an oppressive silence and constant tension that enveloped the house. Michael increasingly noticed changes in Emily's behavior. Her anxious gaze, evasive answers, and constant immersion in her own thoughts only strengthened his suspicions. At first, he tried to dismiss it as mere worry and exhaustion, but soon his intuition, which he could no longer ignore, started telling him that Emily was hiding something. Thoughts of possible betrayal began to fill Michael's mind, engulfing him like a dark shadow. He recalled every moment when Emily seemed distant, every time her expression changed while talking about Jake, and he began to speculate. He tried to calm himself, convincing himself it was just his imagination, but each cold glance and forced smile only deepened his doubts. Emily, on her part, did her best to hide her inner turmoil, but each day it became hard to conceal the truth. Worries about her family and what might happen if Michael found out what had happened with his brother tormented her. At times, she felt like Michael already knew the truth, and it drove her to the edge. She felt trapped, and every movement seemed calculated, like an actress on stage. Meanwhile, Jake, consumed by his obsession, was increasingly sinking into the darkness of his own emotions. He tried to suppress the irresistible attraction he felt for Emily, but each day it grew stronger. Thoughts of her never left his mind, even for a moment, and his sick love turned into an obsessive idea. Jake began stalking her, unable to control himself. He watched her from afar, observing her every movement, her every step. He started following her in the mornings, hiding behind trees when she went for her run. In the evenings, when she stepped out onto the terrace, he found ways to stay nearby, a hidden observer. He didn't know what he was looking for in these moments, but every glance, every movement seemed like a treasure meant only for him. Jake delved into his mad thoughts, imagining that one day she would see in him the one who truly understood her, the one worthy of her. These weeks turned into months of torturous waiting and suppressed desire for Jake. In his imagination, she was no longer just his brother's wife, but a symbol of something unattainable, something he felt he had to possess at any cost. These fantasies consumed his mind, driving him to the edge of madness. He could no longer distinguish reality from his painful dreams, and his gaze toward Emily grew increasingly clouded. Emily began to feel his presence without understanding exactly what disturbed her. Sometimes she felt as though someone was watching her, but when she turned around, she saw no one. These fleeting shadows surrounding her amplified her anxiety. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was no longer just a problem, but something dark and dangerous looming over her life. Her fear of him grew, turning each day into a struggle between normalcy and an overwhelming sense of threat. Michael also felt the growing tension in the house. He saw how Emily started avoiding his gaze, her hands trembling whenever he tried to hold her. The entire atmosphere reminded him of broken pieces that could never be put back together. His suspicions intensified, and one day he allowed himself to think she might indeed have feelings for someone else, possibly even his brother. The thought was so painful that he could hardly bear it, yet it tainted every moment he spent with her. These months became a time of torment and fear for each of them. Michael, unable to trust Emily, searched for answers in her gestures and expressions, only to become more convinced that he didn't like what he saw. Jake, consumed by his own madness, was becoming a danger to both of them, while Emily, torn between her secret and the desire to protect her family, felt her life falling apart. The situation was on the verge of exploding. The slow, dragging months continued to tear apart all three of their lives. Despite all his efforts to keep the family together, Michael felt that with each passing day, he was losing Emily. Her behavior grew increasingly distant and mysterious. At first, he attributed it to simple fatigue, but gradually, a sinister suspicion settled in his heart. His thoughts frequently returned to Jake, and the feeling that his brother was somehow involved became a nightmare from which he couldn't escape. Michael was torn apart, not knowing whom to trust. Meanwhile, Jake was crossing all boundaries. His obsession with Emily had turned into a painful fixation that consumed him entirely. Watching her was no longer enough. He wanted more, to feel her presence, to keep her close. Every time he tried to speak to her, Emily pulled away, her eyes reflecting fear and disgust. But Jake, blinded by his passion, saw this only as a temporary obstacle that he was bound to overcome. One day, as Emily was returning home from work, she noticed a familiar figure at the end of the street. It was Jake. His gaze was piercing, filled with tension and a strange determination. Emily felt a chill of fear run down her spine. She quickened her pace, hoping he wouldn't follow, but Jake, as if entranced, walked toward her. "Emily, please wait," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady, as if afraid that someone might hear them. Emily stopped, realizing that running would only worsen the situation. She turned to him, trying to stay calm, though her heart was racing wildly. "Jake, what do you want? Why are you following me?" Her voice trembled, but she tried to speak firmly. His eyes were filled with despair and pain. "Emily, you don't understand. You're the only thing that matters to me. I can't live without you." These words sounded like a warning, a sinister oath. Emily felt that there was something more behind them, that her life and safety were under threat. Her options were becoming increasingly limited. She could keep trying to avoid him, hoping Jake would back off, or she could seek help, knowing it would tear her family apart, but the fear of Michael's reaction and the consequences held her back from taking that final step. "Jake, you need to leave me alone," she said firmly, stepping back. "There's no place for this. You need to go." But his gaze didn't soften. Instead, it grew more obsessive, more threatening. Emily saw something in him that she had only faintly sensed before. Not just obsession, but a dark intention. Jake was no longer the brother she once knew. He was becoming someone else, someone dangerous. Inside Jake, a mixture of despair and determination churned. He realized he couldn't force her to love him, but he wasn't prepared to walk away either. His feelings had grown into a dark, obsessive idea, and now he saw only one way to keep Emily by his side, to lock her up so she'd always be near. And that thought, like a poisonous seed, took root in his mind, turning into a terrifying plan. In the days that followed, he began preparing. Jake knew he had to act cautiously to avoid raising suspicion. He inspected the basement of his home, setting it up to hold Emily. At first he felt guilty, but soon his conscience faded entirely. His plan was becoming more real with each day. Jake was ready to take her, to make her his, even if it meant the end for everyone he once loved. Meanwhile, Michael continued to feel uneasy, watching the changes in Emily's behavior. He saw her avoiding his gaze, her movements tense and anxious. The distance between them grew like a widening chasm, and Michael began to suspect the worst. He felt something ominous looming over their family, though he had no idea how close the nightmare truly was. Emily could no longer hide her fear. She knew that the threat from Jake was becoming too real, and she finally decided to tell Michael. That evening, as she was returning home, she formed a plan in her mind. She would talk to her husband and tell him everything. She knew it would bring about serious consequences, but her fear for her safety and the family's future was stronger. Her decision was firm. She could no longer stay silent, but things didn't go as she expected. Jake, as if sensing that his plan might be uncovered, waited for her not far from their home. When Emily passed through the thick shadows of the trees, he suddenly approached her from behind, and before she could scream, he struck, rendering her unconscious. It happened quickly and silently, so no one noticed his actions. He carried her to his home, where the meticulously prepared basement awaited its prisoner. Jake's hands trembled, but at the same time he felt a strange sense of relief, as if he had finally achieved what he had been longing for. He locked the door, leaving Emily in the basement, then went upstairs, listening to the silence enveloping the house. Now she was his, if only on his terms. The next morning, panic began to spread through Michael and Emily's home. Emily hadn't come home, and her sudden disappearance immediately raised alarm. Michael didn't know what to think. At first, he tried to convince himself that she'd simply stayed over at a friend's place, but when no one could find her, fear started to overtake his common sense. Concerned neighbors helped with the search, calling anyone who might have seen her, but every effort proved fruitless. Soon the police joined the search, unable to understand what had happened. Emily had vanished without a trace, leaving Michael in utter despair. He searched every corner of their home, hoping to find some clue, but no detail offered any answers to where his wife might be. The neighbors' sympathetic glances were full of empathy, yet Michael could feel a strange, unspoken void within their concern. A week passed since Emily's disappearance, and her absence became an unbearable pain for Michael. Every night he drove aimlessly through the streets, checking familiar places, talking to neighbors, hoping that someone might have seen something. His thoughts spiraled in circles of worry and despair. Only the empty streets and misty streetlights responded to him. He felt as though his life was suspended in waiting, but there was not a single hint, not a single answer as to where his wife might be. Meanwhile, Jake remained at his house, pretending to be equally anxious about the missing woman. But behind closed doors, he acted differently. Emily, sitting in the cold, dark basement, could feel Jake's piercing gaze every time he came downstairs. He brought her food, sometimes trying to talk to her, as if attempting to find a way to her heart. But his words sounded hollow, and his face held a strange mix of guilt and undying desire. He spoke of how much she meant to him, how he couldn't bear to see her suffer in her marriage to Michael, how he was trying to save her. Emily rejected his attempts, remaining silent and avoiding his gaze. But Jake, oblivious to her disgust and fear, kept looking for a way to convince her. He explained that he wanted to create a place where she would be safe, where she could live without worry and pain. His voice was soft, but something dark and menacing glinted in his eyes, making her shiver with terror. Each day, Jake grew more insistent, his obsession turning into a cruel certainty that Emily belonged to him. He watched her every move, trying to read her thoughts, choosing his words carefully to win her over, but her silent revulsion only fueled his dark anger. He felt his patience waning, and the desire to control her became all-consuming. Jake could no longer hold back. His pent-up anger and overwhelming obsession pushed him to cross the final line. He decided to take Emily by force, locking her in the cold basement of his home where no one could hear her screams. He descended towards her, his face twisted with burning determination, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction as he slowly closed in on his victim. Emily felt the menacing intent in him and, panicking, shrank back against the wall, her hands frantically searching for anything with which to defend herself. Jake smirked, seeing her fear, and reached out, ready to seize her. Emily gathered her last reserves of strength and began to resist, desperately trying to push him away. As he moved closer, her nails dug into his face, leaving deep scratches. Jake recoiled for a moment, seized by pain and unexpected fury. He ran his hand across his face, feeling the blood seeping from the fresh scratches. His anger flared even hotter, and he stepped toward her again, ready to punish her for her defiance. But just then, he heard the sound of a car pulling up outside his house. Jake froze, realizing someone had arrived. He shot Emily one last venomous look, then slammed the basement door shut and hurried upstairs to see who had dared to interrupt his dark plans. Standing at the doorstep was Michael. Desperate and searching for answers, Michael had come to his brother to talk, hoping for some kind of comfort. Michael looked exhausted. His eyes were filled with worry and sleepless nights. Jake opened the door with a forced smile, trying to hide both his anger and the scratches on his face, but Michael couldn't help but notice them. "Are you all right?" Michael asked, studying his brother's face, trying to figure out what could have caused such scratches. Jake quickly made a joke, glancing away and rubbing his face. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied with a smile, as if he truly had nothing to hide. "Just a little incident at the bar. I got friendly with the girl, but she wasn't so friendly back. Slapped me with a bonus." He tried to laugh it off, but Michael sensed something unnatural in his tone, as if he was downplaying something that should have truly affected him. Michael continued observing him, feeling a growing unease and distrust. His brother's behavior seemed strange. Every movement, every word held a concealed tension, as if he was struggling to keep something hidden. Suddenly, Michael felt an acute urge to check the house. "I'd like to use the bathroom," he said casually, nodding toward the hallway. He hoped it wouldn't raise any suspicion. Jake hesitated for a split second but quickly regained his composure and, hiding a slight worry, nodded. "Of course, no problem. Go ahead." Michael walked deeper into the house, trying not to reveal his anxiety. He carefully examined every detail, anything that might indicate something unusual. When he reached the hallway, he noticed a door leading to the basement. Something about it caught his attention, a large latch, as if it had recently been fastened with great care. Michael's heart stopped, but he quietly approached the door and carefully unlatched it, trying not to draw attention. For a moment he froze, realizing that he might be about to witness something that would shatter his life forever. When he opened the door and descended into the basement, it felt like stepping into a nightmare. In the dim light filtering through a small window, he saw his wife sitting on the cold concrete floor. Emily was bruised, her clothes torn, her face weary and filled with fear. "Emily." Michael's voice trembled, his heart filling with rage and pain. Jake, noticing a movement behind him, spun around sharply. He realized that Michael had found Emily, and he instantly tensed. Without hesitation, Jake moved toward his brother, and before Michael could comprehend what was happening, struck him on the head with all his might. Michael crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Jake, breathing heavily, couldn't hide a smug smirk. Now no one could stop him. He turned to Emily, who, frightened and battered, was pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with fear and disgust. "Now you're mine," Jake growled as he approached her. "You'll be with me forever, and no one, not even Michael, will tear us apart." His voice was filled with triumph and a twisted determination. He relished the moment, knowing that everything was finally under his control, that he could do whatever he wanted with her. This thought emboldened him. He reached out toward her, but Emily, using her last bit of strength to defend herself, turned away and tried to fend him off. Her resistance only fueled his desire to dominate her further. At that moment, Michael, lying unconscious on the floor, began to regain consciousness. His head throbbed with pain, but memories of what he had seen just before blacking out started to come back. He remembered Emily's terrified face, and fury ignited within him anew. He opened his eyes, and seeing Jake attempting to overpower his wife, he was overwhelmed with uncontrollable rage. Fueled by despair and anger, Michael rose to his feet and launched himself at Jake. He struck him with such force that Jake staggered back, but Michael didn't stop. He loomed over his brother, delivering blow after blow, ignoring Jake's cries and pleas. His rage, built up over months, poured out in a furious onslaught, a desire to put an end to this nightmare once and for all. Michael hit Jake over and over until he realized that his brother had stopped moving. Gasping for breath, Michael froze, taking in what he had done. The room fell silent, and in that stillness he understood that his brother was gone. But there was no regret. Instead, he was filled with a grim resolve. He knew he had to protect his wife and put an end to this nightmare. Michael stood up, surveying the wrecked basement, where a terrifying drama had just unfolded. He embraced Emily, who trembled from the horror she had endured, and with a heavy heart called the police, ready to tell them everything. When the authorities arrived, Michael calmly explained the situation, not holding back any details. They accepted his account, and after an investigation, his actions were deemed necessary self-defense. That horrific night was now behind them, but its shadows lingered, haunting their thoughts. Michael and Emily began rebuilding their lives, striving to forget the nightmare that Jake's obsession had drawn them into. Sometimes, Michael thought back to his brother, reflecting on how things might have been different if Jake had chosen another path. Emily, too, occasionally remembered those moments, feeling relieved yet also saddened by the loss of someone who had once been close to them both.